The gaming industry is degrading, and here's every reason why. If you don't live in a cave, you've noticed how badly optimized modern games are. Every year, the power of graphics cards and their prices increase. The budgets of games and the time to create them are also growing. The only thing that doesn't grow is FPS. It is falling. In recent years, we've seen a bunch of failed releases where poor optimization destroyed potentially good projects. It has become the norm not to play a new game as soon as it is released, but to wait months and sometimes years until developers can optimize it properly. Although new games look amazing, game studios forget about a very important element of a good gaming experience. The problem with poor optimization is that developers are actually alienating almost 90% of their player base. According to a January 2025 Steam survey, only about 10% of Steam users have hardware that can run these games on the recommended settings. The logical answer is to just buy a new PC. But it's not that simple. New graphics card from Nvidia costs thousands of dollars, although there is no significant increase in power over the previous generation. The most expensive GPUs don't even break the 60 frames per second mark, without DLSS, which still works like crap. Although, we used to have enough 2 GB of video memory to play really awesome games in terms of graphics. But what killed the optimization?
That's a good question.
Why don't developers care about making their games run well and look good at the same time?
That's a good question.
Is it all about a secret conspiracy with Nvidia and AMD to simply increase sales of their hardware? Well, it's not really that simple. As with many other issues, it's not so black and white, and there are many reasons for the low optimization in most recent releases. The first of them is the upscaling technology. Over the past few years, artificial intelligence has been developing at an alarming rate. A couple of years ago, we were shocked that ChatGPT wrote us a poem, and now it creates entire codes and replaces most programmers. AI is used everywhere. We have videos, pictures, songs, and of course, graphics created by AI. The scaling technology in video games works like this. The game is launched at a low resolution, for example 1080p, and then AI, such as DLSS or FSR, scales it to a higher resolution, for example 4K. Theoretically, this will allow your game to look like it would in a normal resolution. But this is not quite true. Even at high resolutions, some problems become quite obvious. In Microsoft Flight Simulator, you can see flickering. You can also see it in Cyberpunk. Also, artifacts are especially visible in fast-paced scenes. The AI has to guess how the game will look like in a higher resolution. And as a result, with upscaling enabled, the game will never look the way developers intended. For me personally, it's quite important that the game has the right artistic direction, and I can't help but feel that DLSS and FSR are quick and easy solutions to increase the frame rate that simply distort the original concept. You might be saying right now I can play GTA 6 on my shitty RTX 3060, and my answer to that is, short-term solutions cause long-term problems. Sure, upscaling technology allows gamers to avoid wasting their parents' savings on a new GPU, but this technology also encourages developers not to optimize their games, because they think, hey, these cocksuckers are going to turn on DLSS anyway, so the game will run well. But the problem with this technology are not only on PCs. The PlayStation 5 Pro, which is now the most powerful console on the market and costs over $1,000, also has its own AI upscaling known as PSSR, or PlayStation's Super Resolution. I remember back in 2020 when the PlayStation 5 was introduced, they were preaching that it was a huge step for gaming because developers no longer had so many graphical limitations on how they wanted their games to look. However, it soon became clear that the current generation of consoles could not run games in 4K and at least 60 FPS. After 4 years, the PS5 Pro came to the rescue, where Sony swore that finally, gamers would not have to choose between performance and quality, but they failed. Again. Now, console game developers are forced to adapt new releases to new compromise solutions like PSSR, a technology that only masks hardware limitations, not solves them. In fact, PSSR is a license for developers to be lazy. Why spend time fine-tuning performance if you can just throw the game on the market, add scaling, and claim it's optimization? In reality, what we have is a new console that they sell for twice as much as the regular version, but it can't run new games in 4K and 60 FPS. Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, which is an incredibly good game, by the way, also works in the upscale thanks to PSSR, just like any other console. Only the Xbox Series S doesn't fuck with us and runs in native resolution. we are witnessing the console market degrading. We have moved from real technical breakthroughs to marketing promises that only mask real problems. But upscaling technology, which spoils the picture and allows developers to do nothing and rest more, is not the only thing that has killed optimization. Ray tracing. These two words have become mandatory in every presentation of new gaming technologies since 2018. And although marketers try to convince us that it is almost the holy grail of gaming, the reality is a bit different. Let's take a look at what it is. Ray tracing is a method of light processing that tries to mimic its behavior in the real world. In fact, this is something that Pixar has been using in animated films since 1999. But now that this technology has burst into games, the main question arises. Is it really needed, or is it just a marketing illusion? Here is an example. Cyberpunk 2077. If you turn on ray tracing to the maximum, yes, the lighting looks fantastic, but it will cost you such frame drops that you will have the impression that you are watching a video that was shot in 1878, or like you're playing on a Nintendo Switch. What do we get in return? Puddles with better reflections? Okay, but will the average player notice? Most likely not. Unless you point it out to them. Look, the glare is now displayed differently here, and now you have 15 FPS so you can see it in more detail, loser. And the worst part is that some games don't allow you to turn off ray tracing at all. Star Wars Outlaws, for example, only offers a choice between minimum and maximum ray tracing. Why can't I just turn it off? Why am I forced to use DLSS or FSR upscaling just to compensate for the fact that the developers failed to properly optimize the game? But the main problem isn't even that ray tracing eats up performance, but it has become an excuse for lazy developers. Once upon a time, they created their own unique lighting methods and adjusted reflections manually. Half-Life 2, for example, had great plane reflexes that looked quite impressive in 2004. And now? We just turn on ray tracing and forget about it. Another example is Alan Wake 2, one of the most beautiful games of recent years, which makes extensive use of ray tracing. It looks amazing if you have top-of-the-line hardware. But even with the RTX 4090, it can produce a miserable 30 to 40 frames per second in 4K if you turn off DLSS. And if you have a mid-range card, don't even dream of smooth gameplay without upscaling. But when we talk about the laziness of modern video game developers, of course, we have to mention the damn Unreal Engine 5. The engine that promised to change the gaming industry. When Epic Games first demonstrated it in 2020, everyone was excited. Dynamic lighting, billions of polygons, the revolutionary nanite geometry system, realistic lumen lighting, everything looked like a real leap into the future. We were promised that games would look better than ever, and it would be easier for developers to create detailed worlds. But here's the reality in 2025. Most games running on Unreal Engine 5 are terrible. We have unstable FPS, graphical glitches, blurring, artifacts, and simply unoptimized performance. So what went wrong? Imagine being given the perfect 3D printer that can print anything you want, with no limits. But then you find out that it's powered by a nuclear reactor that consumes more energy than an entire city, but still less than a new RTX 5090. Unreal Engine really allows you to create incredible detail. Its nanite system allows game worlds to contain tens of billions of polygons, and Lumen automatically provides photorealistic lighting. This is all great if you're making a CGI movie, but when it comes to video games, it creates serious performance issues. Previously, developers were forced to optimize their games, manually adjusting the geometry of models, coming up with interesting lighting methods, optimizing shadows and effects. It took a lot of time, but it allowed games to run stably. Now studios simply rely on nanite and Lumen to automatically generate ultra-detailed graphics. But the truth is that even the most powerful graphics cards can barely cope with this automatic detail. The remake of Silent Hill 2, Stalker 2, Remnant 2, and a bunch of other projects from recent years, all these games are made on UE5 and suffer from the same problem: poor performance and strange artifacts. To hide all these shortcomings, the developers brazenly force you to play with TAA, temporal anti-aliasing enabled, which turns a clear picture into a soapbox. Why optimize if you can just throw in ray tracing and say,
well, yes, you need an RTX 4090 for good graphics, and if you don't have one, that's your problem.
However, most gamers don't want to sell their left leg to buy a new RTX 50 for a few $1,000s. We are poor people after all, and I want all the new releases to run smoothly on my GTX 650. But what do I get in return? Unoptimized crap, where 30 FPS is still good, and when you try to raise the frame rate, the game starts to look like any AAA game on Nintendo Switch. Video game development used to be an art of optimization. The game had to run smoothly, stable, and quickly, regardless of whether it was running on a powerful PC, a weak laptop, or consoles. Every byte of memory was worth its weight in gold. Every polygon and every texture was carefully balanced between quality and performance. Take Dark Souls, for example. The game ran on From Software's proprietary engine and, despite all its shortcomings, had stable performance even on weak hardware. The Last of Us is a technical masterpiece for its time. Naughty Dog squeezed the most out of the PlayStation 3, creating a game that looked better than most PC projects. Another optimization genius is Hideo Kojima, who showed a perfect example of a smart approach to performance in Metal Gear Solid 5. Fox Engine, which could produce incredible detail, but at the same time work smoothly on all devices, including the PS3. What's more, the adaptive display technology adjusted the graphics in real time so that the game always ran smoothly. But it's a new world, and in the new world, doing stuff well doesn't pay money. Making stuff fast, selling it fast, and making the next stuff is what pays money. Nowadays, games are released before they are properly debugged. And now add to that the rising prices of hardware, scalpers, and the general greed of corporations that want to sell more and more. PC gaming has long ceased to be affordable. Now it is simply a luxury. First and foremost, developers should think about a wide audience of gamers, not about what interested gaming journalists who can run the game on maximum settings will say about it.
I'm a big fan of good plots in video games. In fact, if a game has a bad story, I won't play it, even if it has great graphics and gameplay. Over the last decades, the gaming industry has shown that drawn characters and thousands of lines of code can tell a story that is as good as the best Hollywood movies. But just like the movie industry with its constant remakes, stretched out franchises for the sake of money, and cliched plots, the video game storyline has also degraded. But why? Why do we want to erase our memories so that we can play games like Mafia 2, The Last of Us, or Assassin's Creed 2 for the first time? And we also want to erase our memory to forget the existence of such garbage that has been coming out in recent years. Why do writers no longer want to create good stories for video games? And why even the outstanding franchises that once served as the benchmark for storytelling excellence in the industry have turned into formulaic slag that suffers from self-repetition and does not try to offer something truly high quality and fresh? In this video, I will analyze in detail the main components of the game script so that we can understand why we think that good stories are disappearing and how exactly narratives in game worlds are degrading. There are 5 main components of each scenario. If I worked for one of the consulting companies, I would add one more, but I am not a racist or sexist, and I do not believe that some groups of people are more important than others, as Sweet Baby and others do. So, each of these components is in every script for every book, movie, or game. Each of these components is just as important as the other, and each of them has been degraded in the game industry. The first thing we'll talk about is the characters. I don't need to explain how important this aspect is in every game. Games, unlike movies, provide a unique opportunity not just to watch the characters, but to live their lives, make their decisions, and feel their losses as your own. They are a bridge between the player and the story, through which we can feel part of this world. Let's try to understand why. For example, Joel from The Last of Us and Vito from Mafia 2 are such cool characters whose stories we return to again and again. Vito Scaletta is the protagonist of Mafia 2. He had clear motives. He wanted to get out of poverty and find his American dream by any means necessary. That's why we emphasize with his story and his losses, because his path from a petty thief to a member of the Mafia family was morally understandable to us. His motivations were clear and down to earth, and they coincide with most of the players. Conversely, Joel didn't have a clear motivation from the beginning. It came from the circumstances of the game. But thanks to the fact that the writers were able to clearly describe his psychological portrait, which was made complex and realistic, like every person, with all their good qualities and bad. His loss, which we were shown at the beginning of the game, as well as what the world turned into, made Joel who he became and helped develop him as a character. Every action and decision he made throughout the game was clear to us, even though that could be described as horrible and possibly wrong from a moral point of view. But we understood why he was doing it because we felt his pain and his reasons. And this is actually a perfect example of a very well written character. Just imagine, the scriptwriters were able to make us support and fully understand the decision of a man who decided to save only one girl who was nobody to him instead of saving humanity. And all thanks to his backstory, which was properly realized, that it was the prologue, in which the future foundation of Joel's psychology was laid. When he kills a doctor who is trying to find a vaccine to save humanity and then kills dozens of people in the hospital, it sounds like a fucking maniac, but it wasn't. Ellie was also also well written. A girl who was born into a cruel and punitive world, who did not have the love and nurturing that modern children have, grew up into a rough girl who could defend herself. Even her constant swearing looked quite natural and not rejecting. The same cannot be said about the protagonist of the recent game Forspoken. At first, it may seem like the writers used the same techniques to create Frey as they did for Ellie. The constant swearing that was probably supposed to make her cool. I don't know.
Shit, fuck, shit.
The dangerous world in which she has to be strong and fight for her survival is very similar to Ellie's story. But why does everything in Forspoken feel so cheap and empty? Frey is a prime example of how writers don't understand what makes a character truly alive and well developed. And the attempts of the developers and some consulting company to make the character trendy and attractive to a young audience look like a cringe. Instead of making Frey an interesting, deep personality, her lines often sound like they were written by children.
Did I just do that?
Well, definitely with my assistance.
I did not just do that.
Constant sarcastic comments and jokes not only break the tone of the game, but also alienate the player from the character. Although, this same sarcasm seemed to work well for Ellie.
They turn into fucking monkeys.
The dialogue in Forspoken, which are supposed to reveal the character, look like conversations from Netflix series for teenagers.
Well, it isn't worth anything. Why can't I have it?
Because I'll kill you. Shut up.
It's noticeable when Frey starts complaining about her life, but she does it in a way that makes the player sympathize more with the person who has to listen to her monologues than with the character herself.
I didn't have a mother or a father that wanted me.
I don't give a shit.
Let's also mention Danny Rojas, the protagonist of Far Cry 6. He's so unlikable that this is probably the first time you've heard his name. This is a character that the player can customize by choosing a gender, but that's where Danny's personality ends. His or her dialogue often boils down to banal phrases that are supposed to show him or her as an ordinary person, but instead make the character so faceless that it's hard to even remember any memorable moments with his or her participation. Although, to be fair, I don't remember there ever being a good protagonist in the entire Far Cry series, which is not the case with the antagonists. Oh yeah, probably a whole generation of gamers jerked off to Voss from Far Cry 3. But even without taking into account his popularity, which may have been overrated, he's a very good example of what a villain should look like. He remained in the player's memory because of his unpredictability and philosophical digressions. Even with all his fucking insanity, we understood him and why he was like that because the writers were able to reveal the background of his formation. Okay, now let's take a look at the main antagonist of Far Cry 6. Compared to him, Anton Castillo looks like a very cliched tyrant who simply serves as additional advertising to sell the game. Antagonists in modern games have generally become a symbol of simplification and cliche. I really can't think of a single good villain that really felt like a villain. It could be a charismatic tyrant like Pagan Ming, or Dash van der Linde, who turns from your friend and mentor into an enemy who doesn't just do evil for evil's sake. His choices are dictated by his fear of change and loss of freedom. The main antagonist may not even be human. In The Last of Us, the role of the villain is played by a cruel world that has lost its humanity and hope. In my opinion, the attempt to please everyone plays a big role in the degradation of characters. Many modern games feature neutral and safe characters who try to avoid conflicting traits or sensitive topics. As a result, we get characters that are indifferent, and this simplification is so noticeable that it even goes beyond the plot and directly affects the gameplay. Star Wars Jedi Survivor is not a bad game, but man, there are so many faceless secondary characters. In fact, they just serve as a guide or explanation rather than real personalities. In The Witcher 3, you didn't just take another quest from another character. You understood why this quest was so important to him. You experienced the story of the Blood Baron because the developers gave a shit about his emotions and the motivation behind his actions. You were drowning in tears at the end of Mafia 2 because Joe, although not the main character, the writers managed to reveal his relationship with the main characters so that we could get attached to him, because throughout the game, this secondary character was properly involved in the main story. He had his own tragedies and his own difficult decisions. But in addition to a properly written lore, characters need something else to be properly integrated into the story. And that is conflict. Now, I'll try to explain what conflict is for a character. For example, you are the main character in your own life, and now you have a quest to watch this video to the end without writing a shitty comment. But on the other hand, you have a sincere desire to write what an asshole Radical Cap is, and the struggle with yourself is your conflict. You fight it, and you fight and eventually lose, and you write I'm an asshole. In video games, conflict is a central problem or series of problems that force characters to act. It can be an external conflict, such as with enemies or circumstances, circumstances, or internal conflict, such as with personal fears or moral choices. In RDR2, the internal conflict is mostly evident in Arthur Morgan's struggle between his loyalty to the gang and his own moral principles. God of War is also based on an internal conflict. Yes, we have some shitty situations with the gods and monsters of Norse mythology, but it mostly exists for a beautiful background. In fact, the main conflict of Kratos is his internal struggle with his violent past and his attempt to become a better father for Atreus. It is his struggle with his own emotions and his desire to teach Atreus to live differently from himself that drives the story. External conflict can also be the basis for a good script. In the Assassin's Creed series, before it became shit, it was an external conflict between the two organizations of the Assassins and the Templars. In the Far Cry series, before it became shit, the external conflict was also about surviving in a region filled with terrorists and saving yourself and your loved ones. But in fact, writers reached their peak when they managed to write both internal and external conflicts well. In Spec Ops: The Line, the protagonist, Captain Walker, faces the external conflict of surviving in post-apocalyptic Dubai and completing a rescue mission, but he also has an internal conflict, his struggles with the moral consequences of his actions. The game simply forces the player to question whether he is really a hero or a criminal who justifies his terrible actions with the illusion of heroism. Multi-conflict is also well presented in Detroit Become Human. Kara, Connor, and Marcus face an external conflict with a system that oppresses androids, but the real depth of the story lies in the internal conflicts of each of them. For example, Kara faces the question of what is more important, survival or humanity, whereas Connor is torn between the programmed code that makes him serve people and the newly discovered emotions that make him go beyond his machine mind. Now let's see what kind of conflicts new games give us. Most studios create conflict in their games simply as a banal obstacle. Cliched stories where we need to destroy crowds of NPCs because they're bad, and then the main boss because he's also bad. But it's not even as boring as probably more cliched conflict in new video games, just becoming the big guy, where you need to deal with another rival organization, as it was in the last Saints Row, or just capture some territory, which is the main conflict in almost all the latest Ubisoft games, and not only. But man, can repeating the same things throughout the game for some ephemeral goal, like just destroying bad people because they're bad, be a good conflict? The main problem is that developers try to compensate for the weakness of conflicts through large-scale, repetitive actions, which makes the story cliched and predictable in almost all cases. Oh man, we're finally getting to the plot. It's probably the most important part of any script and the most dreaded in modern games. The plot is a chain of events that moves the story forward. Of course, we'll mention RDR2 now. For all its immersiveness and very slow gameplay, the story in this game develops so well that it doesn't make you bored at all. We constantly change locations with our gang, and these locations throw up different scenario arcs and unexpected developments in the main story. For all its slowness, and perhaps even its length, this game is still considered the best for me in terms of plot. Another good example is Assassin's Creed 2. Even at the opening credits, you already realized that there was going to be a fucking epic story, and it didn't matter that the credits appeared almost in the middle of the game. But this is the benchmark for what a game's cliffhanger should be. One that can instantly grab the player. And after the beginning, the story develops no less coolly. We see how the life of Ezio, a young and carefree aristocrat, turns into a real tragedy when his family is betrayed and killed. This moment is shocking and gives the player a clear goal of revenge. The story does not stand still, constantly revealing new conspiracies and intrigues. The game itself ends with a mystery, the first civilization, which creates the impression that this is just the beginning of a bigger story, which allowed Ubisoft to make some more money on the next two parts of Ezio's story. In The Walking Dead by Telltale Games, the story begins with the player's immersion in the zombie apocalypse, but this is only the background. The opening sequence, where Lee meets little Clementine, creates an emotional connection that becomes the heart of the game. Unexpected twists and turns, difficult decisions, and the deaths of the key characters always keep the player on their toes. And the ending of the first season, man, I was not ready for that. Mass Effect 2 demonstrates how to build a climax properly. The whole plot is a preparation for a great sacrifice, which in the end works very hard for the player. BioShock deserves special attention because of its unexpected twist. The player thinks that he is just completing a task and helping the rebel, but then it turns out that all his actions were manipulated. The single phrase, "Would you kindly?" has more cultural significance than all Ubisoft's scripts over the past 5 years together. But what's the situation with stories in the industry now? It's really bad. Over the past few years, I've never experienced a masterpiece plot, Maybe a few good ones, but for the most part, projects that had potential turned out to be very bad in terms of story. In Gotham Knights, the story starts with an interesting tie-in, the death of Batman. Gotham needs new heroes, and after 4 parts of the Batman game, it's a pretty logical and interesting decision. But why the fuck did the developers implement it so poorly? The potential of this idea is quickly squandered at the very beginning of the game. Instead of developing the theme of the loss of a mentor, the game turns into a lot of similar missions against the organization of the Court of Owls, or something like that, which have no dramatic weight. The characters are uninteresting and faceless. There's no suspense throughout the game, and the ending doesn't leave you with a sense of accomplishment or achievement. After the success of the first installment, Horizon Forbidden West had great opportunities for a deep story, but the plot is too overloaded with tribal politics and complex world details that are not presented in an interesting way. The developers are trying to make the world multifaceted and complex. But why? It doesn't affect or develop the plot in any way. Even in the first half of the game, I simply stopped following the events because they seemed too mechanical, predictable, and complicated. Dying Light 2 is another failed sequel in terms of plot. It was supposed to be a serious story about survival in a world where moral dilemmas become more important than fighting the infected, but the plot turned out to be too vague and uninteresting. Many missions don't add anything to the overall story, and they have more in common with Ubisoft games than with the first part of Dying Light. I also want to mention Mass Effect Andromeda. I believe that this game shouldn't have been made at all. The first 3 Mass Effect titles were BioWare's magnum opus in terms of plot. The trilogy was logically completed, and it seems like no one needed Andromeda except EA investors. From the very beginning, the plot of the 4th Mass Effect installment looked too simple for a franchise of this magnitude. The plot about the colonization of a new galaxy might have promised some kind of epic story, but the development of events was reduced to completing tasks for the sake of developing the base, not because of dramatic events or unexpected twists. But in the script of any work, there is a component that can either save any average plot or not very interesting characters, or vice versa, make even the best story boring. And this is the setting. A well-chosen setting can easily immerse the player in another world, create an atmosphere that enhances the plot, and provide a context for the events. If the setting is well created by the writers, the game world can be a separate character in itself, telling its story through architecture, landscape, sound, and even color palette. Let's look back at Skyrim. It seemed to be just a game about dragons and a medieval fantasy world. However, every village, every ruin or mountain has its own story that can be felt without even dialogues. Abandoned fortresses hint at ancient battles, taverns are filled with character about current events, and meetings with travelers on the trails add a sense of reality. We are not just completing a task, we enjoy learning about the culture of the Norsemen, observing their tradition and conflicts. A completely different, but no less ingenuous approach is demonstrated by BioShock with its underwater city Rapture. This is a place where the ambitions of humanity collided with its greed and irresponsibility. Rapture's not just a backdrop for the action, it is a symbol of the decline of utopia, and every crack in the walls or remnant of luxury tells the tragic story of the city's inhabitants. The atmosphere is so tense that even the simple sound of water or the echo of footsteps can cause fear. The history of the city is literally written on its walls. At the same time, both parts of Red Dead Redemption show how you can use a realistic setting to convey a sense of time and place. The Wild West in the game is not a cruel and harsh world where the strongest survive, but a romanticized version of it. The locations are not only beautiful, but also functional. The player feels how this world works. Trains come on schedule, cities live their own lives, and nature reacts to the change of time of day. Now let's look at where things went wrong. Let's take Forspoken. Despite the visually appealing world of Athia, which was the main focus of this game, it quickly becomes clear that this world is empty. Even though the location looks fine, they don't want you to explore them because they lack a story. The developers didn't have enough creativity or money, but all the missions look mechanical, and the NPCs who were supposed to animate this world lack any personality. Even big studios with big franchises behind them are no longer able to create worlds that stay in the player's memory. Remember, as soon as Star Wars Outlaws was announced, it seemed like it might finally be a good Ubisoft, and it was mostly because of the atypical setting for the studio, which was already a cult in culture. All they had to do to not shit themselves was to make it on the same level as EA did before them. The Star Wars galaxy is a legendary global franchise that has been creating unique planets filled with life, diverse cultures, and intrigue for decades. But something went wrong in Outlaws. The planets, while visually beautiful, offer nothing to make the player believe in their authenticity. There's a lack of interactivity in this game, and each planet looks like just a set of zones to complete missions. Skull and Bones has a similar problem. it is another failed Ubisoft project. 10 years ago, the studio showed how to create an ideal marine world in Black Flag. The audience really liked this game and wanted a sequel, but this is not the same studio as it used to be. We got a boring live service that took 7 years to develop. Skull and Bone is a great example of how a game with an ambitious setting can lose its potential. In Black Flag, each location had a meaning, and pirate battles, interaction with NPCs, and various events such as random attacks by warships, treasure hunts, or shark or whale hunts created a sense of a dynamic world. Instead, in Skull and Bones, the locations look template-like, and the basic survival mechanics quickly become routine. The game world doesn't feel alive. The player's actions exist in a vacuum without any impact on the overall context. There's a lack of interactivity that could make the world interesting. The usual shitty live service, which was expected to fail because no one needs it. A good set is not just about graphics or scale. It is a living space that can tell a story without words. Unfortunately, most modern games forget about this, focusing only on superficial aspects, which makes their worlds look soulless. And finally, let's talk about what theme is. The main idea or message of the story. A good story should give us something to think about, or some idea that the writers put into the plot. It can be a question of love, revenge, survival, self-sacrifice, or moral dilemmas. Remember the winter chapter of the first The Last of Us, where Ellie is forced to survive on her own? Of course, such a complex game has a lot of underlying ideas, but it was in this winter part where we first gained control over Ellie that we realized that Neil Druckmann was trying to immerse us in the theme of innocence facing a world of cruelty. Ellie, who has been more of a child in an adult world, up until this point, is forced to make difficult decisions that reveal her strength but also leave emotional scars. The culmination of this part is the final scene where Ellie single-handedly defeats the leader of the cannibals, creating a clear stage of transformation from a girl who depends on Joel to a strong person. However, this victory still leaves behind a sense of heaviness and trauma, which perfectly matches the overall mood of the game. Another example, probably one of my favorite games from Ubisoft in terms of story, is Valiant Hearts. It's funny because the studio, which is known for its failed projects that cost hundreds of millions of dollars, was able to make a great game with the best story for Ubisoft with a budget of a bag of chips and a busted can of Coke. Valiant Hearts tells the story of war from a human perspective, not from the point of view of the heroic battles we are used to seeing. The main theme of the game is the compassion and suffering of ordinary people during the First World War. The game makes you think about the cost of war through interaction with simple tasks that reflect the everyday life of the characters. For example, the moment when one of the characters helps to treat soldiers demonstrates how humanity can survive even in the darkest of times. But 10 years later, Ubisoft's writers decided that the main theme and ideas could be shit on. Far Cry 6 is an example of a game that had every chance to realize the deep theme of revolution, but instead turned into a set of cliches that make us not feel that freedom is worth fighting for. Horizon developers also degraded the theme. While the first part delved into the problems of the consequences of human impact on the environment and the ability to adapt, the second part boiled down to just a beautiful picture and a superficial story that leaves no emotional response. I don't want to analyze every game right now, but I really feel that the old games, which were mostly more serious, gave us complex themes and ethical dilemmas. The choice between good and evil not only affected the plot, but also formed an emotional connection with the characters. You felt the weight of each decision and thought about its consequences. The games left room for internal conflicts and reflections, and after completing them, we felt heavy and deep. We didn't notice how this approach was replaced by superficial moves in story-based games, where the choice comes down to the obvious. The protagonist is always a hero, and he fights the bad guys because they are bad. This creates the illusion of choice, but in the end, it robs the story of the depth and gray morality that exists in our real world, where there is no simple good or simple evil. Games used to demonstrate that morality only makes sense when there is an alternative. If you don't have the choice to be evil, being good means nothing. Let me ask you a question. When was the last time you played a shooter that you really enjoyed? It may not have been that long ago, but then I'll ask you again. When was this game released? I can see that you're thinking right now. Most likely, this game was released a long time ago. Although we can say that this genre has simply died, and that studios have focused on other games. Actually, no. Shooters are still released quite often. However, most of them are just bad at best. Maybe we have 1 or 2 good shooters a year, but compared to what this game used to look like, it's a shame. Just look at how many good, great, and truly legendary shooters were released back then, all in 1 year. For me personally, this genre is quite personal. These were the first games I played as a kid. I still remember Wolfenstein Return to Castle, which terrified me as a child. The first Far Cry, which seemed incredibly realistic at the time, and of course the first 2 Call of Duty games. which probably made me fall in love with video games. If it wasn't for these shooters, maybe I wouldn't be playing video games now. I wouldn't be making these videos, and I would have a good life. Fuck! I used to play Battlefield 2 as a kid saying, I can't wait for the future. The improvement of the game is going to be so insane. Holy fucking shit. But how is that shooters, once the most popular genre, which in fact had the greatest impact on the heyday of the gaming industry, have now degraded the most? It is the games that are most loved by the audience that receive the least attention from developers today. And I don't want to say that the gaming industry is getting worse in general. No. We have many examples where genres such as online games, co-op, and almost every popular genre are still holding the bar. And in each of them, we regularly get at least a few really strong releases a year. But for some reason, shooters are the most random releases today. In most cases, every new game is a disappointment. And for a long time, I couldn't understand why this particular genre has fallen so far behind the rest. I couldn't understand it until now. It was the mid-2010s, and the gaming market was exploding. New generation consoles were becoming more and more popular. Online gaming was becoming the mainstream, and DLC and digital distribution platforms were emerging. What was once just a product is turning into an entire ecosystem. Developers are beginning to realize now that nowadays a game is not just about selling it. It needs to be maintained. For a game to live, you need to return to it. And for a player to return, they need to be kept. And at this moment, we see how the very popular Call of Duty franchise has started to repeat itself very often. And this is very understandable. They are already releasing the 7th or 8th installment, but these self-repetitions are no longer happening in the franchise, but in the middle of even one game. The missions become trivial, boring, lacking something new, but still, shooters are still at a pretty good level. If in the early 2000s we received campaigns for different countries when we were thrown into different epic locations of the Second World War, then in the conditional world at war, this was no longer surprising to players. Anyway, this is a topic for a separate video, but I miss good shooters about the Second World War so much. When we played these first Medal of Honor or Call of Duty 2, and now you can see these dubious attempts to do something in this set from Activision and EA, you realize that modern game developers are detached not only from history, but also from reality. By the way, let's recall the Battlefield series, which became popular due to its unique map design, realistic physics, and the scale of the battle, also began its transformation in the same period, the first half of the decade. And yes, Bad Company 2 was also not bad, but it is already clear how developers have reached their peak in game design and the internal structure of their projects. Almost all shooter mechanics were perfected then. We got good stealth shooters, great realistic military simulators, and trashy action games like Bulletstorm. This was the peak, and as always happens, after the peak, there is an inevitable decline. It's not that players didn't care about it, but publishers realized that if this genre wasn't changing somehow, it would most likely stop being played, and even the biggest franchises could die. At this point, publishers started creating games not to impress, but to retain. Instead of remember, it was come back tomorrow. And this is where the shooter genre became the perfect candidate for a destroy and monetize project. Excuse me. This genre is simple in its basic mechanics, with a huge audience and the highest interaction rate. It doesn't require lengthy explanations or long tutorials, complex mechanics, or a deep plot that not everyone will understand. Every shot, every kill, every action of the player is a ready-made trigger for a small reward that can be instantly converted into a way to make money. It is this speed and simplicity that has made shooters the most convenient field for experimenting with seasonal battle passes, cosmetic items, temporary events, and endless reward cycles. Because the simpler the mechanics, the easier it is to add something bright and unnecessary to it. Something that doesn't change the game, but creates a habit. And shooters, like a depressed teenager without a father, began a period of great transformation. From about 2015 to 2020, shooters finally lost their face. But the worst thing is not even that they started to change. The scary thing is how quickly they agreed to abandon everything that made them a genre. And if we're talking about the fact that developers now needed to retain the player rather than surprise them, it is obvious that online shooters have become a priority for publishers. It all started with hybrids. Overwatch is a shooter where you have to shoot, but it's not the main thing. The focus there is not on controlling the situation. It's not on shooting, and not on decision making, but on flow. It's on constant action, on animations, on something happening all the time. Destiny went even further. Instead of the classic levels, there are hubs, strikes, and endless replays. What used to be a structured shooter has now dissolved into grind. After the first 10 hours, you're not interested in the game. You just do it because something new will come up. Not even better, just different. Then Valorant came along. Mechanically, it looked like Counter-Strike, and visually, it looked like shit. Apex and Warzone don't even feel like shooters anymore. It's just pure dopamine. One match and you don't even remember what just happened. The second one, and you already don't want to stop. Not because it's good, because it's always flashing, moving, and exploding. Your brain doesn't have time to process anything. It just rides the inertia. And considering it's an online shooter audience, well, let's just say the bar for cognitive processing wasn't that high to begin with. Simply put, Call of Duty has turned into cash on duty. But yes, I was just talking about multiplayer. Of course, it's easy enough to criticize something that objectively contains a bunch of shit in it. However, story-driven shooters, which were once the backbone of not only this genre, but the industry as a whole, have also degraded. And they degraded for a rather miserable reason. But before I go on, I want to tell you guys something important. If you want to see my future videos that YouTube will not censor, you can become my sponsor. I made only one membership level because I believe that everyone should be equal. India, you should learn this. The price of my sponsorship is just the same as if you were to follow someone on OnlyFans. And I guess this comparison doesn't really help me promote it, but anyway, it will help me a lot. Thank you. In fact, when I first researched this topic for this video, I initially wondered why story-based games have been so heavily downgraded and simplified. It's clear why online games should be focused on player retention, not on one-time enjoyment. But story-based games, in theory, should just give you a good experience and that's it, right? Maybe once. But nowadays, story-based shooters are no longer directly profitable. They can't be sold in parts, they can't be milked for years, they can't be broken down into seasons. You complete the game, and that's it. It's over. You're left with an impression, but no profit for the developers. And looking at this, publishers have found the only way to use story-based shooters properly. They simply turn them into a decorative addition to multiplayer, into a marketing wrapper, which is needed not as a new exciting experience, but as content that they will use for their trailer. Here's the hero of the center of an explosive chase. Here's an NPC saying something pretentious. Here are the rendered cutscenes. That is, everything that was relevant 10 years ago. Is there really no room for the genre to develop further? The paradox is that budgets have grown, technology has soared, the possibilities are endless, and ambitions have become less. If you look at the development of the genre in the 90s, it was explosive. From Doom 2 to Call of Duty 2, from Half-Life to Modern Warfare, everything changed in 5 years. Game design, pacing, storytelling, level structure, quality of production. Each game tried to surpass the previous one to do something that hasn't been done before. It was a period when the genre was constantly evolving, when you got a new game every year, but it was definitely superior to almost all of the previous ones. Nowadays, story-driven FPSs are no longer products of inspiration. They have been a costly part. They're not made because someone wants to say something. They're made because without that campaign button in the main menu, the whole game just feels incomplete, empty. And when creativity becomes a decoration, it dies. And of course, publishers don't need it. And even more so, players didn't need it either. In 2018, when Activision released Call of Duty Black Ops 4, without a traditional story mode, focusing exclusively on multiplayer, the developers explained that more players spent more time in online modes, and the campaigns became less relevant. Although, as for me, it was the Black Ops sub-series that had the strongest plots in the entire franchise. EA did the same thing. They realized that they had made the single-player campaign in Battlefield 5 so shitty and thought that only multiplayer in Battlefield 2042 would be enough for players. And sadly, this is really enough for the audience. So maybe the problem is with us. Maybe we've become so dumb, and there's simply no point in developers trying for us. We don't play games anymore. We just move by inertia. We don't think, plan, or study. We just react. A shot is a reaction. A sound is a reaction. A flash is a reaction. It's like when you're scrolling through your racist meme algorithms in Reels, and each new clip beats the last one just by being new. Your brain doesn't have time to process anything. This means that no experience is created. There is no I remember left. Only, I'll play a little more. And this is the ideal state for a developer, because if the player doesn't remember, they don't get tired. If they don't get tired, they don't ask questions. They don't notice that nothing changes from mission to mission, from year to year. Shooters are no longer built on innovation, new mechanics, and unique design, but rather on psychological loops that don't ask you to solve something, but ask you to keep going. This constant stimulation can lead to a state of hyperarousal, a fucking complicated word that basically means your brain is stuck in a state of constant overexcitement. This makes it difficult to concentrate, manage emotions and impulses, and can cause sleep problems. In addition, excessive use of this type of video game can change the activity in certain areas of the brain, similar to changes seen in other types of addiction, and there's even research on this topic. And maybe I sound a little bit like an angry parent who constantly forbids playing these stupid computer games, but it's just psychology. The dependence on fast dopamine hits in shooters is similar to the mechanisms used in social networks like TikTok. Each like or video view triggers a dopamine release, which creates a positive reinforcement cycle and can lead to addiction. Thus, players may feel the need to return to the game or platform looking for the next dose of pleasure. And it's a good thing that old school developers 2 decades ago didn't give a shit about all this player psychology and how to keep their audience for years. They created and wanted to surprise. And once upon a time, they created something that we still want to return to. And I'm already expecting a lot of comments from angry kids who are fanatical about the games popular now. But I really feel sorry for you, because we grew up with much better games. Not so long ago, the release of a big game from a well-known studio was something incredible. We were waiting for it, we wanted to play it, but most importantly, we were sure that the next AAA game would be really good. But somehow, unnoticed, it all remained in the past. Nowadays, the budgets and development time of AAA projects have increased several times, but for some reason, the quality of these games is only decreasing. But why do most big projects fail so often lately? And why do so many gamers claim that modern AAA games are garbage? Before the state of the gaming industry became as bad as it is now, large publishers and their studios reached an ideal state for their business. They were able to secure their market position, a fairly stable profit margin, and protect numerous intellectual property. They became the main predators of the industry. However, the problem began when these large companies stopped competing with each other. Instead, they decided to simply claim market territories, like rulers trying to protect their tiny pieces of land on an island. We call these territories video game genres. Have you ever noticed that some publishers only release a small number of games within certain genres? At first, you might think that developers are just releasing what they know, but the real problem is that when market presence begins to be fragmented, the need for innovation also decreases. In the early 90s, alongside the first Battlefield, DICE released Racing and Shrek, while Activision, together with Call of Duty, created strategies and games based on Madagascar and Ice Age cartoons. However, the publishers realized quite quickly that it was much more profitable and safer to just occupy one niche and try to dominate it. So AAA companies grew and grew, unrestrained by the conflict of competition. But at the time, unbeknownst to anyone, they began to stagnate. AAA games usually have large teams, expensive marketing campaigns, and huge amounts of funding. The term was borrowed from the credit industry and applied to games when obese corporate bigwigs realized that video games were no joke, but a business that could make more money than Hollywood. For the big publishers, AAA means this is the safest investment you can make to make a profit. This is no longer the case. Today, AAA mostly indicates the aspirations and cost of the game, not how safe the investment is. From the 80s to the 2000s, there weren't many real commercial failures in games. Most of the failures were hardware related, bad consoles and bad business decisions. But since the 2010s, game budgets have grown exponentially, and we've seen massive failures. And in the last 7 years, it seems that many beloved franchises have released what fans consider to be the worst parts. One of the biggest factors in the decline of AAA games is that they have become too big. For comparison, the good old World of Warcraft was created by a team of 40 people. A team of 100 developers worked on Half-Life 2, and now, more than 9,000 people were involved in the development of the shitty Diablo 4. Approximately the same number of people in Activision's office are now deciding what the next Call of Duty cringe skins will be. Let us recall Starfield, which was developed for 7 years. The budget of this project was about $200 million. Yes, we have 1,700 planets to explore, but wasn't it better to just get 100 that were actually good? AAA games have exploded in size, scale, and cost to an unprecedented level. On the one hand, a large team has the potential to create something truly incredible, to realize their greatest ambitions. But this depends on having a coherent vision among many people, as well as the budget and resources to realize it. However, the more ambitious a project is, the more money is invested in it, and the more risky it becomes. Let's recall Concord, which was supposed to become Sony's new flagship in the hero shooter genre. Firewalk Studios joined PlayStation in 2023, and Concord was their debut project. According to the preliminary estimates, Concord's budget reached $400 million, making it one of the most expensive games in history. The development itself lasted about 8 years. And this sounds strange, at least since even the largest projects like GTA or Call of Duty operate with similar budgets and a much wider target audience. But despite many years of development and significant investments, in the first week of the game's release, it became clear to everyone that Sony had just fucked up almost $500 million. The peak of simultaneous players on Steam was about 700 people, and less than 2 weeks after the release, Sony announced the closure of the servers. And Concord became the first and last release from Firewalk Studios. But how could such a situation happen to a company as experienced and large as Sony? Why was Concord, this random debut game from unknown developers, hyped up with such an atypical huge budget and high expectations? Well, this situation was not accidental, or just a bad strategic decision by Sony, and now you will understand why. COVID-19 has changed a lot of things. People who were able to survive bought a hell of a lot of video games during this time, and some game companies decided to adjust their business. They saw this as an opportunity to significantly increase investments, expand project production, and hire more employees. But, of course, the boom in video game sales caused by the pandemic did not last too long. And now we are seeing its consequences. More than 20,000 layoffs in the next 2 years after the pandemic. More than 30 studios closed, and with it dozens of projects that were in development. The last 2 years have been pretty bad for game developers. Perhaps during the pandemic, big publishers hoped that COVID would be around for a long time, but overloading teams with employees and billions of dollars is not some kind of magic recipe for success. In fact, it has put studios in a much more difficult and stressful position, because if a game doesn't sell well, it's the developers who are to blame, not shareholders who can't think strategically. Blockbuster development costs are out of control. According to a report by the British Competition Authority, one major studio reported that it costed $660 million to develop a major franchise, while marketing cost almost $550 million, meaning that total budgets for AAA games can reach almost $1 billion and even exceed this huge figure. So yes, Suicide Squad, which is played by 130 people, probably has an inflated budget. It seems that every next big budget game is a lottery. Of course, companies want to reduce and avoid all possible risks, so again, they rely on already popular franchises and stick to what most players are familiar with, what the audience is used to. On the one hand, it sounds safe, but is it really so? To make a game worth hundreds of millions of dollars safe and potentially attractive to a large audience, studios have to simplify and dumb down a lot of things. They cannot take risks or experiment. They have to stick to what has proven to be effective. That's a huge reason why indie games like Helldivers 2 or Lethal Company are much better at innovating on a popular formula or giving us something completely new. This conditional safety has led us to the fact that some Call of Duty or Battlefield or any other popular franchises do not change at all from year to year. But this is not cool. Gamers like to be surprised. Let's see what developers have been surprising us with over the past couple of years. Nothing. I'm such an old fart that I remember the PS3 era and even the PS2 era when AAA games represented a certain level of quality in terms of technical achievements as well as gameplay. You got a polished product that had a certain level of content. Now we can't say that anymore, and I would even say that most AAA games are not even worth it, especially at the release stage when there are indie games that are much more enjoyable. And here we can take a look at a few specific reasons why. And the first one is an unnecessary open world. So today, AAA means a huge open world. This is done so that game publishers can justify the technical progress and content of the game, which deserves a price of $60 to $70. However, when a game has an overwhelming open world, it can do more harm than good, especially when the open world adds nothing to the gameplay itself. If this huge map doesn't help with the gameplay cycle, not only increases the distances you need to travel to get from point A to point B, then it's just a hindrance, not an advantage. There are games that use the open world to their advantage, such as Metal Gear Solid 5 or Skyrim. And then there are worlds, like the latest Ubisoft games, that seem empty and have rather stupid NPCs. Instead of having a world that you can explore, you're stuck with a bunch of quests and missions that have repetitive and boring formats. They will simply be multiplied to increase the hours to complete to justify the high prices of these games. But this is not the only thing that leads to their unjustified pricing. Technological advances in graphics and gameplay often lead to higher prices. With that in mind, when you play a game like Stray that costs $30, is it half as much fun as playing the new Call of Duty for $70? I would say no. We live in a time when it is getting easier and easier easier to create video games. I see games like Project Wingman, developed by just a few people, giving franchises like Ace Combat a run for their money. So, aside from the fact that a slight improvement in graphics costs twice as much, I think most people would agree that AAA games are overpriced. But even with such high and unjustified prices, they still have the nerve to shove in microtransactions. For many games, it seems that gameplay has taken a backseat to loot boxes and battle passes. EA is known for its sports games such as FIFA and Madden, where new versions use the same gameplay and sometimes even contain bugs from games released years ago. In such cases, you pay not only for a low quality game, but also for microtransactions to get at least some normal gaming experience. Unfortunately, for companies such as EA and Blizzard, this is a really successful strategy because it leads to higher profits and a revenue stream that offers better long-term prospects. Because of this, the trend is not likely to stop anytime soon, making AAA games a less promising proposition for gamers today. But when you pay for a game and shell out $60 or more, you usually expect to get a finished game. However, this is not always the case. I don't need to explain to you right now how terrible the state of games has been in the recent years. It's becoming more and more common for a game to be released and then improved over the years. This gives companies two advantages. First, the ability to release a part of the game and then add the rest over time, as well as to receive recurring revenue from gamers in the form of add-ons and other items that can be purchased. Secondly, publishers believe that any problems found during the launch can be immediately fixed later with patches. This means that the first players actually act as testers of the game and do some of the work that the developers should have done for them. From a business perspective, I find this extremely insightful and pragmatic. From a gamer's point of view, I would consider it a ripoff if I bought an unfinished game and was used as free labor. So, of course, after this attitude towards the audience, many gamers are increasingly focusing their attention on independent developers and small studios. There are many games that I find much more enjoyable than many of the AAA games I've played. Undertale, which you most likely haven't heard of, is a prime example of a game that subverts RPG tropes. Signalis, which I recently played, manages to recreate the creepiness of Silent Hill 2 while doing its own unique thing. But what do all these games have in common that I think is missing from big budget games? The answer is that these games have a voice. While a AAA game has a lot of developers, designers, and performers, it can often turn into a messy mess with too many cooks. Indie games don't suffer from this, and as a result, they don't have an identity crisis, and they usually have a clear game cycle that has been well tested on a fundamental level. So the AAA industry continues to fall, desperately grasping at the few handles they can grab to slow the fall. Fortunately, for many large companies in this business, it is already too late. While these companies are trying to put on a strong face among the opposition they face, people like me, who know full well how long they have been scraping the bottom of the barrel, know how close their end is. These companies are lying and cheating their customers in a desperate attempt to milk them for as much money as possible to save themselves and satisfy their investors. They have begun to see that the bottomless well of money they once drew from does in fact have a bottom, and that it is much shallower than they expected. Like a cornered animal, the AAA industry has tried to capitalize on the social justice movement led by politically correct people. Of course, this has failed spectacularly, sliding them even further down the slope of ruin. It has damaged their reputation beyond repair.
I'm a big fan of open world games, and I remember when I first launched The Witcher 3 almost 10 years ago, playing it at a very low frame rate. And no, the Nintendo Switch hadn't been released yet, I just didn't have a powerful PC. But despite the numerous bugs and low FPS, I was fascinated by this game, and all because of an incredible open world that I hadn't seen in any previous game. But what's worse, I won't see it in almost every game that follows. Since the release of The Witcher 3, we've seen dozens of other big open world projects. Some of them were quite good, and we'll talk about them today, but most of the games were just bad. The game worlds not only remained the same as they were 10 or even 15 years ago, but they degraded. But why? Why did the big game studios that once created new standards for open world games just start creating big maps that made no sense? Why is it that when you play a new Assassin's Creed, Outlaws, Starfield, or almost every new game, you get bored in the beginning and you just force yourself to play on because you just bought this shit? And this feeling is very different from when you were a kid and you were enthusiastic about exploring the world of Skyrim or the third Fallout. In fact, the degradation of modern open worlds is not due to the greed of large corporations that just want to make a new game quickly to make money.
It's also not because modern developers are lazy or incompetent enough because they were hired through the DEI program rather than because of their professional qualifications. In fact, most open world games have degraded so much because game studios, for whatever reason, started making 3 fundamental mistakes. These problems have started to occur more and more often in the game industry, which personally makes me very worried about the future of open world games. And the first reason is the lack of a meaningful story. The third Witcher had something I hadn't seen in any open world game before. Its entire huge map was filled with deep side quests that developed the plot and the world. Every corner of the open world had its own story, atmosphere, and unique characters. This created the feeling that the vast expanses of the continent were not just very beautiful, but also important and alive. But now, we see how Ubisoft can still create a beautiful landscape, but this beautiful picture is devoid of any emotional connection with the player. Why should I give a fuck about beautifully drawn trees if there's nothing to do between those trees, or the beautiful and detailed landscapes, if I'm forced to do the same thing for the whole game for dozens of hours, which often has nothing to do with the main story? And the story itself is often created just to be there. Previously, we used to play good story-driven games with an open world as a bonus. Now we play an open world that just tries to keep us engaged for more hours, where the bonus is a template plot that no one gives a shit about. For this genre of games, a good story, both main and side stories, must not be just good, but very good. If a new Call of Duty or other game with linear levels has an average story, it won't be a big deal. But in games that intend to engage us for 50 or even 70 hours, you have to give us a story that will grab us and keep us engaged, and not collecting the same collectibles or destroying the same outposts. Unfortunately, this is a big problem for modern open world games. Weak, superficial story, or its almost complete absence. The story is the foundation that unites all the elements of the game, gives it meaning, and motivates the player to explore the world. In the past, games like The Witcher 3 or RDR2 offered players deep, multi-layered stories that affected emotions and created a connection with the characters. But now, we see how developers often sacrifice stories for the sake of scale. A huge world filled with question marks on a map cannot compensate for the lack of a quality story. Once upon a time, Ubisoft was one of those who laid the foundations for this genre. This company was the one that knew how to combine a good adult story with an open world. Even before going bankrupt, Ubisoft had so many good and financially successful franchises that it could easily have become the new Rockstar. But it didn't. The latest games in their Assassin's Creed and Far Cry series are just shameful limitations of their franchises. Behind the slight improvements in graphics, we see a massive degradation in the story. Valhalla has the most boring story in the history of the entire franchise, and at the same time, it is the longest game in the entire Assassin's Creed series. For more than 100 hours, you have to walk around a huge world in which the main story simply dissolves into endless quests of the same type. A weak story and a lot of unnecessary icons on the map make the game boring as hell. Without a clear motivation or emotional involvement, every quest and every location seems empty, even if they are technically filled with content. And this is not just my words full of hatred for Ubisoft, it's simple statistics. More than 40% of Assassin's Creed's Valhalla players didn't even reach England and quit the game right after the prologue. That's 4 fucking hours of game. 4 out of more than 100 hours that thousands of developers have been working on for several years, and which turned out to be useless to anyone. And this happens not only with Assassin's Creed. A quarter of Starfield players couldn't even complete the first mission, even though it's only the first 30 minutes of the game. And only 17% of players completed the first part of the main story of Star Wars Outlaws. Although I don't think that's a lot, considering that 17% of everyone who bought this game is also about 17 people. But still, we see that compared to old games that are replayed from time to time, new games from the same developers become uninteresting for most people at the beginning of the story because of its superficiality and general shitty nature. Stories, both main and side, in modern open world games suck. And why is that? It's pretty damn simple. It's the desire of big publishers to reach a wider audience. Developers create worlds that are aimed at everyone, avoiding complex or risky plots that could lose some players. This is very strange because we see specific examples when a good story could have a relatively empty world. Mafia 2 had a small and static world with minimal interactive elements, but I gave a shit. The story was great. LA Noire had a big but empty Los Angeles with absolutely nothing to do. Who cares? It was a good tense detective story. Another great example is Death Stranding. If not for the brilliant story, no one would play this game with its monotonous gameplay and empty open world. And I'm not saying that the story is the most important thing for open world games, but it's definitely the thing that makes the world worthwhile for the player. But the game studios don't give a fuck about the quality of the story. Another fundamental problem is the lack of interactivity, which makes the world alive and, to some extent, realistic. Now I will ask you about something that is very difficult for a person who loves video games. Think about what surrounds you when you go out. No matter how long ago it was, try to remember the sounds, smells, people, and cars. Hundreds of thousands of details surround us in the real world, and you can interact with all these details. Everything has a meaning. Now, look at what open worlds in video games often try to surprise us with. The same thing porn actors do, with a large size. But why do we need a large size if there's nothing to do there? Developers, such as the fucking Ubisoft, often fill their words with a lot of secondary content, useless collectibles, outposts, and meaningless quests that just repeat throughout the game. But none of this gives us true interactivity. Even though we have to spend dozens of hours on useless grind, it doesn't change anything in the game world. Just remember what interactivity looks like in Rockstar games, and it's important to understand that I'm not talking about side quests here. In RDR2, we had main story quests and side story quests for characters that stretched for over several separate missions, creating separate story arcs. But in addition to all of this, we also had random events that had nothing to do with either the main story or the side storylines. And these small and random stories were also a great way to make the open world more alive. Every time you rode your horse from one mission to the next, you would encounter some motherfuckers who wanted to rob you, or who were just going about their business that affected you and the game world. NPCs behaved as if they were living their own lives independently of the player. And the main thing is that the game allows you to interact with it. That's why most open world games feel empty and predictable, even though they're filled with NPCs or all sorts of unnecessary activities. It all feels static, patterned, and just repetitive. And that's really a shame because Watch Dogs Legion, Avatar, and even Assassin's Creed Mirage show that Ubisoft is not that crooked yet, because the worlds in these games look pretty good. But the beauty of the world is not supported by anything. It's like pouring water into a Coke can. Yes, now the water looks good, but no one wants to drink this shit. Another problem is that Ubisoft's game development model has somehow become the standard for the industry. Other studios started adding similar mechanics to their games. This can be seen in Horizon Zero Dawn or Cyberpunk 2077, where most of the activities seem to be content for content's sake. A lot of question marks, but do you really need them? As a result, the open world genre loses value, becoming more of a tedious task than an exciting experience. Of course, nobody wants to copy the Rockstar model, when the entire map is dotted with details and interactive zones because it took you decades to develop the game. But still, why do we need a big world if there is nothing to do with it? But this is not even the main problem with open worlds in modern games. The main problem is the lack of attention developers pay to other aspects of the game. For whatever reason, game studios have started to give a fuck about gameplay, new mechanics, and optimization. Maps are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But is it enough?
No.
Modern developers. Okay, maybe it would be better to say their bosses, or rather the publishers who give them the money to develop games. So these cocksuckers in suits are not interested in making sure that you have a good time in their next game. They are interested in making sure that you have a lot of time. Think about it logically. Will a horse's balls getting smaller in the cold increase the number of hours it takes to complete a game? Of course not. Are the intricate detective stories that are scattered all over the map and which are too complicated for the average Assassin's Creed fan? Also no. Firstly, great attention to detail and the creation of interesting mechanics requires a high level of creativity, which the developers certainly do not have. And secondly, over the years, we see how players are simply comfortable doing the same thing throughout the game just to be able to move on with the plot. That is why the industry is stagnant. Why change if it works this way? Every year we get the same game but in a different package. The same mechanics, the same story, the same gameplay, only a different environment. Also, other aspects of the game can suffer when developers deliberately move to the open world. What do I mean by that? In the gaming industry, there have been cases when a franchise switched to open world gameplay and other content suffered in order to support this very large open world. A good example of this is the Mafia series. I like this series. The first and second Mafia had fairly small maps. In fact, it's just one city where plot events take place. but absolutely nothing happens in this city. Yes, there are small interactions, you can customize a character or rob something, but mostly because there is nothing to do on the map. You just move through the story and hardly pay attention to anything else. So we can say that there is no open world in the game as such. But when Mafia 3 came out, something changed. We see some new patterns that were not inherent in the first two parts, but rather resembled traditional open world game mechanics. Most likely, Hangar 13 developers paid attention to Ubisoft's working model of open worlds when developing this game. Open world games are in high demand, and ordinary companies see it as an easy way to increase sales. That is why they put territory capture, collecting unnecessary stuff, and other traditional Ubisoft mechanics into their games. But the more time developers spend on making the world bigger and more similar to other franchises, the less time they have for other aspects of the gameplay. That's why Mafia 3 is so different from its predecessors. Instead of focusing on just a good linear story, we got a buggy Far Cry with territory capture, which also looked bad. The creators of Mafia 3 decided not to imitate their predecessors, but to direct the franchise into the standard open world model, which, firstly, bored everyone, and secondly, does not suit the series at all, with its deep criminal plot that does not overload with unnecessary activities. As a result, we got a shitty Mafia 3 and bankrupted Ubisoft. And you know, I was quite pleasantly surprised when I saw the trailer for the next Mafia. It looks like the series is going back to its roots. The location will be in Sicily. I don't think it will be a big map. Most likely, it will be a linear game with a good dramatic plot that will take 10 to 12 hours to complete, everything we liked about the first two Mafias. However, this franchise is not the only one that suffered because the developers wanted to clumsily switch to the open world model. We can see how the approach to mission creation is changing in the latest Call of Duty games. And you can call me a shithead, but I really prefer the usual levels where we stupidly go from point A to point B, killing NPCs at the same time. I don't see Call of Duty as a multi-layered masterpiece of the gaming industry. For me, it's more like another Michael Bay movie where everything explodes. There's a cliched plot about tough guys and gameplay that doesn't require any thinking. But I just recently finally finished the Black Ops 6 story campaign, and I see how Raven Software is trying to move away from the typical model of the series. And yes, they managed to do something new. Most of the game takes place on large maps, and sometimes very large, as in one of the missions in the desert. But for me personally, these were the worst levels. You drive around the desert, just doing the same thing. It looks like Activision just wanted to artificially increase the game's time. Since they received a lot of hate for the last part, they decided not to create more levels, but just to make them long and boring, because it's cheaper and much faster. Of course, we can't say that Call of Duty is now an open world game, but if that ever really happens, oh man, I think it will be terrible. So open world games are dying, and it sounds very paradoxical because every year there are more and more of them, and a large audience still plays this genre, but all these projects are the same. They have no authenticity, and developers just make the same mistakes. So, I spilled a lot of shit, but I didn't offer anything. How do I see the solution to this problem? Well, it's very simple. First, stop making big maps. Nobody needs them. If you can't fill them with good content, just don't make them. The next thing is NPCs. Successful open worlds like Red Dead Redemption 2 show that NPCs can create the illusion of a living environment. They have to react to the player's actions, have their own things to do, and remember if the player has done certain things. It should not be like Far Cry 6, where NPCs are just static decorations that repeat the same actions, which quickly kills the sense of reality. Also, dear game creators, start creating normal side quests. A good example is The Witcher 3. I still remember a side quest where I had to go in search of a missing man, and a normal quest turned into a whole story about loss and revenge. Also, take care of the rewards. Collecting dozens of unnecessary 3D models in boxes is not interesting. I'm reminded of Mafia 2 when you had to find all the Playboy posters on the map. It was appropriate. You collect all the posters that you can then jerk off to. It's a good mechanic. And if this sounds too much for you, you can remember The Last of Us, where we collected cards with superheroes in different locations or something like that. I explored every nook and cranny, and I really wanted to find them, because there was a story behind these cards. The writers first explained to us the importance of these cards, and then I wanted to find them all myself because it was important for the characters and their world. It wasn't just another achievement to complete the game 100%, it was part of the story. And finally, my dear developers, please find a balance between scale and content. If the publisher is greedy and doesn't give you the funds to create a big and good game, just make a good one. We don't need big open worlds. We need good open worlds. Why do software developers and hardware companies spoil us with new revolutionary technologies every year while the technical state of video games not only doesn't improve, but sometimes even deteriorates? Why do games that are more than 10 years old often look much better than modern projects packed with the latest technologies? And why is it that the more graphics degrade, the more powerful a computer is needed? First of all, let me say that technology is very important. Technology matters. Technology is always good. Objectively speaking, without it, you would not use top-end equipment, play your favorite games, watch this video, or any other. Even ray tracing, which often gets its fair share of criticism, is a genuinely cool feature. So if technology is great, what's the real problem here? From here on, it's all about the real shit. Here's the truth. Advanced graphical tech doesn't guarantee a game will look good. The beauty of visually stunning games isn't just down to programmers. For something like Far Cry 5 to look photorealistic, the credit primarily goes to the 2D and 3D artists, modelers, and designers. Only after that do the programmers come into play, writing shaders and making everything run. And here's the kicker. Far Cry 5 isn't a technological marvel. High-res textures, long draw distances, global illumination, and bump mapping aren't revolutionary. Developers have been using all this tech for years now, but Far Cry 5 doesn't have advanced hair rendering and physics like in Tomb Raider or The Witcher 3. No real-time reflections, no nanite, the stuff devs have been flexing with lately, and not even ray tracing. Basically, Far Cry 5 feels like a technically outdated game. But then how is it that Far Cry 5, for all its technical backwardness, is a very good game not only visually, but also in terms of resource requirements? Why do modern games run worse, and if they look better, they are only slightly better? In the old days, we always felt a significant jump in graphics when a new generation of consoles came out, which was obvious and massive. And now, when we have these dozens of teraflops on consoles and powerful RTX graphic cards for thousands of dollars, we play games that are not much different in graphics than projects that were released 7 or even 8 years ago. And sometimes, these powerful devices for thousands of dollars do not even allow us to play at a stable 60 frames per second. But what exactly prevents technology and powerful hardware from giving us truly breakthrough graphics and good optimization? It's all about coherent and uniform design. What the fuck is that? That's a good question. In fact, graphics in a game can be called coherent and uniform when all or most of the graphic elements are designed at the same level. When you look at the picture as a whole, the eye does not cling to anything. And the interesting thing is that a coherent and uniform graphic can be primitive and non-technological. Moreover, integrity and uniformity apply not only to graphics and not only to games. Let me give you some interesting examples. Let's take fine arts. It's clear that there are different types of drawing, and there are many different genres and artistic styles. For example, there's a painting by Emmanuel Lutz, Washington Crossing the Delaware, and this is Marilyn Diptych by Andy Warhol. Since these are different areas of fine art, it is very stupid to compare them with each other. However, we can say for sure that individually, they are complete and uniform paintings in their own style that attract attention, give aesthetic pleasure, and, most importantly, are pleasant to look at in their own way. After all, nothing is out of the general style. Now, imagine a situation where a picture of George Washington is a Star Wars aerial battle, people are holding a McDonald's flag, the water is acid pink, and the meme's Mike Wazowski is standing on the left. Yes, it looks fucking awesome. But still, it doesn't look like a monolithic and coherent work. And not only because Wazowski and Star Wars starships have nothing to do with it, but because the drawing style of the individual elements is different and jarring. After all, a pile of elements with different drawing styles does not help normal perception. Another good example is movies. It's no secret that special effects can either create a wow effect or completely kill the magic of a movie. The first Terminator is a great example. The problem with the movie was the low budget, and Cameron and the team had to do some tricks to shoot the special effects scenes. That's why the T-800 looks so unnatural in some scenes. However, there were several such scenes throughout the movie. Therefore, knowing what tricks the crew went to because of the low budget, all this can be forgiven. And it works the same way in video games. Here are two rather unexpected examples, namely GTA San Andreas and Minecraft. It's clear that Minecraft was not so much backward in terms of graphics for its time. The game was generally perceived as a graphic gag because at first glance it looked like something from the last century. Although it was released in the same year as Battlefield 3, Batman Arkham City, and Crysis 2. which were breakthroughs in terms of graphics. In 2011, Minecraft was very backward in terms of graphics and was only on par with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. However, unlike many games, Minecraft is a great example of a coherent and uniform design. Everything ingenuous is simple. No budget for fancy graphics? Let's make it primitive in everything. The result was an amazing cubic world in which all textures were pixelated, and geometry and animations were primitive. But this primitivism extends to everything you see in front of your eyes. You can feel differently about Minecraft, but in terms of graphical integrity and uniformity, it's a brilliant project. It's a pity that many players have not appreciated this genius and are adding mods with retracing and various texture packs. But shaders that make the water transparent and are very realistic won't make the land and sand on the coast look as realistic. So graphical mods are a surefire way to spoil your perception of graphics in Minecraft. The situation with GTA San Andreas is much the same. The game was released in the legendary year of 2004, and given the graphics revolutionary games that were burning up video cards at the time, San Andreas looked like a little brother with a developmental delay. But no matter how disgusting the graphics were in GTA San Andreas, they were disgusting in everything. It is for this reason that this game did not cause visual discomfort at the time, and for some people even now. You could hardly see a cutscene where a detailed CJ is holding an object worse in detail than himself. Poorly detailed characters with crooked animations walked through a soapbox with low detailed furniture and held something that somehow resembled certain objects. And that's why the remastered Grand Theft Auto, the definitive edition, looks so fucking bad. The developers of this shit, who are not actually connected with Rockstar Games, obviously forgot about the same integrity and uniformity. And for some reason, they decided to improve not all textures, but only a part of them. And instead of improving the detail of everything, they focused on the lighting and puddles on the asphalt. Imagine what tasty screenshots they could make to advertise this remaster. As a result, we have this shameful crap. An uneven plasticine mess with gorgeous headlight shadows and disgusting models. So now we know that graphics technology alone is not enough to make a game's graphics good. But when all aspects are worked out at the same level, even if this level is not very high, you can achieve a good result even without technology. And when art designers, programmers, and engineers start working together, working hard on every graphic component and skillfully using the coolest technologies, we get incredible graphic breakthroughs, which unfortunately are very, very few. However, back in the days when some of you were still in your dad's balls, almost all games looked great. When developers were driven by a desire to create something good and authentic, where everything fit together perfectly. Perhaps that's why the first Call of Duty, Quake, Hitman, and many great old games have remained in our memory as having incredibly good visuals, although in fact, nowadays their graphics look very backward, somewhere around the same level as modern games from Ubisoft. But the real graphical peak happened in 2004. It was then that 3 games were released that completely changed the way gamers thought about graphics in games. Doom 3, Far Cry, and of course, Half-Life 2. All these games were technological and breakthrough projects of their time. Lighting, models, physics, geometry, texturing. 2004 was indeed a revolutionary year for the gaming industry. There's just one small nuance. It was the year that marked the beginning of developers' wrong priorities in making graphics in games. And the reason for this is the first Far Cry. Despite all the gorgeous open spaces, beautiful shaders, and good physics, Far Cry was not coherent and uniform. Here and there were undetailed textures, and the character models were pretty bad. But the problem was that at that time, most players evaluated the graphics not in the game itself, but by the beautiful screenshots on the back of the disc box. It was then that the developers realized that what matters to the average player is not the uniform elaboration of graphic elements, but rather certain aspects that are simply well seasoned with color correction and bright design. And here we go straight to 2007 and 8. It was at this time that the most breakthrough and voracious game projects were released that simply mocked the consoles and computers of the time. It was the second graphical peak in the history of video games when Crysis and GTA 4 were released. The first Crysis is still a joke about beautiful technological graphics that few people can afford. Crytek crammed a shitload of different technologies into their game, and even though the game had some graphical flaws, the result is still a project that looks very decent even 17 years later. Crysis is a great example of how technology is good but you also need to be able to work with it competently. Even though the system requirements were way too high for the time, Crysis blew minds with its graphics and worked fine. Rockstar with its GTA 4 screwed up a bit. And how painful it is to admit this, given that the fourth installment is perhaps the best part of the series in many ways. At the time of its release, GTA 4 had gorgeous lighting and shadows, and the world was filled with objects that were pleasing to the eye. However, the textures and character models turned out to be one of the game's two major problems. And the other problem was, of course, the lousy optimization, which some people still can't get over. GTA 4 is a good example where the developers implemented half of the technologies well, but just gave up on the other half, and it turned out to be a shitty situation. And then, everything continued to get worse in the gaming industry. From about 2009 to 2013, in the last years of the Xbox 360 and PS3 lifecycle, games were released that were not significantly better in terms of comprehensive improvements of graphical parameters, but almost every game paid most attention to shaders, all kinds of colorful and grainy filters, and other cheap picture decorations. And the developers can be understood because the console market brings in more money, which means that the graphics need to be adjusted to console standards. Besides, as I said before, most gamers don't give a shit about coherence and uniformity, because it's much easier to attract attention with beautiful screenshots and rendered cinematic trailers. There were some stagnation, and this stagnation was also accompanied by an increase in system requirements. And then, really powerful computers began to appear that could run Battlefield 3 and Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. And I'm already prepared for a lot of dislikes and hate in the comments, but I'll still say that Modern Warfare 3 was much more beautiful than the third Battlefield. For all its hardware and technological demands, Battlefield 3 was never graphically coherent and uniform. For good textures and lighting, the developers had to pay with reduced detail of locations, which was very striking. And of course, Battlefield was much more demanding than Call of Duty. But Modern Warfare 3 may not have been as cool as its competitor in terms of new technologies, but the developers did everything right. They left the development of graphic elements at an average level, but in everything else. The result was a nice looking game with adequate requirements that didn't hurt the players' eyes. And now let's talk about the good stuff. And this good, oddly enough, is related to the previous generation of consoles. I really believe that the Xbox One and PlayStation 4 were the times when perhaps the most beautiful games were released. And in confirmation of my words, we can see how many remasters were still being made of games from the last generation, especially without changing anything. And why? If a conventional Uncharted 4 released 8 years ago or Witcher 3 released 9 years ago look on par with modern games, and sometimes even better. It was in the period from 2014 to 2016 that a lot of really beautiful and moderately even projects were released. Perhaps due to the new generation of consoles, developers were able to untie their hands and try to do their best. But in 2018 and 2019, something changed. It's a crossroads in the game industry in terms of graphics. I both love and hate this period for a simple reason. It was during these years that we got the technology of ray tracing in games and some really cool projects in terms of graphics. However, the rest of the games not only remained at the same level, but also began to degrade in terms of graphics. It was the beginning of the end. Yes, we got RDR 2, God of War, and Death Stranding, which stood out graphically from other projects. They were beautiful and revolutionary, and interestingly, these games were originally console exclusives. Although, it is traditionally believed that consoles are the main problem in the development of graphic technologies in the gaming industry. This is far from the case. The main problem of graphics degradation is... Yes, as paradoxical as it may sound, the most powerful platform on which we can play with the new best graphics is the very problem that has caused games to stop developing technologically. And before PC gamers turn this video off, and they never know that I think PC gamers are lovely and nice people, I'll try to get my point across. Game developers, especially large studios that can churn out the same projects every year, actively and closely cooperate with video card manufacturers. And it is logical to assume that the creators of most popular franchises, which always sell well, see no reason to make graphics better, but they need to sell new powerful hardware. That's why it turns out that now the graphics are usually improved where it's not particularly noticeable. For example, they add extra polygons, and now your 4060 video card is a piece of crap that can't even give you 60 FPS in new games. So of course you need a new RTX 5090 for $2,000. That's why right now we see such a big jump in system requirements, even though graphics are not progressing much. Just 10 years ago, 1 GB of video memory was enough to play really beautiful games. Now, you need at least 6 gigabytes to play the lame Star Wars Outlaws. Are you fucking kidding me? And strangely enough, consoles are not to blame for the degradation of graphics. We have plenty of examples of games on consoles that may not have been technologically revolutionary, but they were uniformly worked out at an average or even high level and did not cut the eye. But in any case, maybe over time, developers will finally realize that with all the resources they have, they can create a really beautiful game.
So what ties all of these games together? Apart from poor quality and obvious financial failure, these games have something else in common, and it's just incredibly big budgets. But how do these projects, which seemed like an obvious failure at the time of the first teaser, get the green light and hundreds of millions of dollars in budget from publishers? Are the top managers of the largest gaming companies dumber than ordinary gamers like you and me, and don't realize that Saints Row, which looks like a mobile game, or another live service that does not stand out from hundreds of others, will definitely fail, and it is better not to invest in such games? In general, why have we seen that in recent years, that the bigger the budget of a game, the more likely it is to be shitty? It should be the other way around, right? Well, in fact, this situation is much deeper and more interesting than it might seem at first glance. To begin with, let's recall the classification of games by their budget. We have AA games, usually developed by studios with 50 or 100 people. These projects have average budgets that very rarely exceed 50 million. Sometimes such games can be quite popular and even bring in good money. Kingdom Come Deliverance or DayZ are great examples. Then, there are also indie games. Very small studios work on them, which may even include just one person. Due to limited budgets, indie game developers often have to sell drugs to support their families. But usually, these games have some artistic value and have some soul and uniqueness compared to everything else in the industry today. But what these classes of games have in common is that they all have budgetary constraints. They don't spend a lot of money on marketing. Big publishers are reluctant to invest because they think it is risky. Game companies want to be sure that their next game will not only pay off, but will bring in a lot of money. Therefore, they invest in a large-scale game and its marketing campaign. They invest hundreds of millions and allow developers to make such projects for 5 to 7 years. And these are the games that we call AAA. However, nowadays, they are not even considered the most expensive. Not so long ago, 2 new classes appeared. These are AAA plus games. Sometimes the budgets of these games are enough to make several Avatar movies. There is also another class, quadruple A games. This class is the newest, but something tells me that we will see a lot more of these games very soon. But right now, these 2 classes are to blame for the fact that the gaming industry looks pretty bad. It is the developers of these games who have to take responsibility for the fact that games in general have degraded, lost their soul and identity. Stay hydrated, boys. And I will definitely explain to you in detail why this happened and where these new categories came from, but that will come just a little bit later. Now, we have to go back to the old days, to the end of the 90s, and find the exact moment when publishers started investing really big money in games for some reason. Let's rewind the clock Let's rewind the clock back 15 years from now, when life was simpler. Girls were girls, and if you had a PSP, you were the coolest kid in school. And if you had a PS Vita, you would definitely get bullied. But anyways, 2009, the year Uncharted 2: Among Thieves was released. It was a game created by people who really love games. The second Uncharted didn't feel like just a product to fulfill financial plans, but something where developers had the opportunity to realize their creativity and some kind of vision. And they succeeded. A good script, high quality voice actors, very diverse gameplay, cinematic action scenes like the building collapse or the famous train scene were perfectly integrated into the gameplay. And from the beginning to the end, the game looked very expensive and large scale. So with all of this, the developers of this game did it for only $20 million. I think I hit my mic there. $20 million. Now, that's not even enough to hire Ubisoft psychologists for their developers. It's not much compared to today's huge budgets,
but Uncharted 2 has become one of the best and most cinematic experiences in gaming. But how did they manage to realize one of the most complex technical games of the time on such a small budget? In 2009, Naughty Dog was not working under the pressure of an investor's desk, diversity control, and definitely not in the narrative of a marketing trend. Having recently gone through it again, I realized that they wanted to create a game that felt, not just functioned. Feeling is something you can't buy for even $200 million, and we can see it now. The modern industry is pumped with money, like a gym bro with a broken heart. He looks cool on the outside, but hollow on the inside. Although I wouldn't really say that the industry is hollow now, because there can be shit inside, like Suicide Squad with a budget that was 10 times bigger than Uncharted 2. And so you can say like this is inflation and the development time has increased, but not 10 times, dude. Every aspect of Suicide Squad is much worse than the game that came out 13 years ago and was 10 times cheaper. And I can see how I've already bored you with Uncharted 2. But I really want to use this game as a good example of how you can make a very good AAA game with a small budget. And this budget was really small, because even before the release of cool exclusives from Sony for PS3, there were already those in the gaming industry who spent hundreds of millions of dollars on games. In 1997, the first blockbuster or AAA game was released, Final Fantasy VII. It cost about $145 million to develop, which is about $234 million today. And it was the most expensive game at the time. The developers took such a risky path because they wanted to move to the next level in the industry. The game was cinematized with expensive CGI. It had orchestral music and an innovative mix of gameplay and dynamic cinematography at the time. However, the risk was fully justified. The game became a commercial and cultural phenomenon. Sales exceeded all expectations, totaling more than 12 million copies, and making the game one of the making the game one of the most successful projects in the entertainment industry. It was after this that big companies realized that spending Hollywood budgets on developing bouncing pixels for nerds could be quite profitable. Big publishers like EA, Ubisoft, Activision, and Rockstar Games started creating games with budgets of hundreds of millions of dollars, investing huge amounts into developing, advertising, and fake sales reviews. Popular franchises such as Call of Duty, Grand Theft Auto, and Assassin's Creed regularly set new standards for financial investments and revenue. During this period, there seemed to be no limit to the growth of costs. AAA was only getting more expensive, but at the same time, it was getting better. So there was nothing to complain about. People knew that if the game had a bigger budget, it would definitely be good, and very often, that was true. But at some point, everything started to change. 2010, 2010, APB was released, something that GTA Online with a budget of over $100 million. Despite the fact that this project closed after 3 months, APB was a kind of founder of live services in the future, and ironically, this game was the same shit as what they spawned. A bunch of technical bugs, an empty world, and high monetization. The development studio went bankrupt, and the game was sold to another company for only $1.5 million, with a budget of over $100. Next was Kingdoms of Amalur, a fantasy with a budget of $100 million, with cool writers and ambitions on the level of Skyrim, but it ended up with failed marketing, a little more than 1 million copies sold, and a financial collapse for the developers and large debts. Prototype 2 was a big budget from Activision, but for some reason, it was again a financial failure for a big game, followed by the closure of the studio. And of course, The Order 1886, a super picture, cinematic presentation, and it was a pretty good game. At the very least, Sony expected a hit, but also a financial failure. And these are just a few examples of financially failed releases of the first half of the 2010s. But it was at this time that publishers finally realized that big budgets in the AAA prefix did not guarantee success. And when your most expensive games start failing more and more, and the audience is discovering alternative genres, what do big publishers do to mitigate the risks? They make their budgets even bigger. The obsession with huge development costs is starting to infect the industry on a massive scale. And many of the AAA franchises that we're getting are starting to turn into soulless and bloated products created for the widest possible audience. Publishers are now so afraid of losing money that they prefer to produce boring, safe copies instead of giving something really good and new, because it can be risky. It was at this point, when the AAA prefix was already so commonplace for the industry, that the biggest publishers decided to change things up and add the plus symbol. AAA Plus was a completely new category in the gaming industry. The budgets became even bigger, but the quality of these games, for some reason, only decreased. 2016. This is the year when Blizzard gave birth to a fancy, colorful, politically correct demon. The success of Overwatch was undeniable. This game became the first truly successful and large-scale live service project. Regular updates, seasonal events, microtransactions, and monetization. Overwatch has shown that if a game lives long enough and constantly generates revenue, it does not need to be replaced with a sequel. It was a key moment when live service became a new standard. Immediately the following year, Epic Games released Fortnite Battle Royale, and this moment can be considered a point of no return. For the first time, a free game was able to outperform most paid AAA games in terms of profitability. Developers began to realize that the game could be turned into a store, and players into customers who needed to be retained as long as possible. And even companies that used to release good story-driven AAA projects that were important for the industry are now starting to realize that if they want to earn more money, they need to make live pipelines. Oh, fuck. Ubisoft and Activision are completely changing their vector. Plot, quality, experiments. All of this has been put on the back burner. In 2018, they actively promoted the game service model in Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Although the game remained single player, it has regular updates, an in-game store, and experience boosters for real money. Then we see the failed Skull and Bones, which was part of a big strategy to move to service games. And in this case too, a huge budget and years of development did not guarantee a very good result. And the same thing happened with many other AAA Plus releases. It seemed that in the pursuit of profits, publishers lost their understanding of what makes a game interesting. AAA Plus has become a symbol not of innovation, but rather the fear of risk and blind copying of models that seem to work. Despite the technological progress and resources that were invested, it was in the AAA Plus era that we got some of the least inspired games in recent years. It's fair to say that most live services objectively look much cheaper than regular AAA story-driven games, even those that were released much earlier. However, at the same time, they have many times larger budgets. In Skull and Bones, for example, we can see outdated gameplay and graphics that don't even reach Black Flag, and it all cost $250 million. But this was far from the most expensive AAA Plus projects. Destiny cost about $500 million, which is $100 million more than Red Dead Redemption 2. Warzone, which is actually just a DLC, costed $250 million. Suicide Squad costed $220 million, and this is actually quite a lot, considering that the development of Death Stranding, Horizon Forbidden West, or God of War Ragnarok cost half as much as these cartoonish live services. But tell me, do these AAA Plus games really look at least half as good as AAA story games? Are licenses for LGBT characters or the development of outdated mechanics that can be found in ready-made presets on the Unreal Engine really expensive? Where do these costs come from? Well, it doesn't actually take a lot of money to create outdated graphics, but to turn it into a product that will bring in a lot of money on a consistent basis, you need to spend a lot of extra shit. The fact is that a story-driven AAA game is, by its very nature, a complete product. The development has a clear end goal: to create a complete, composed experience regardless of whether the player plays the game once or 10 times. Investments are made in directing, animation, recording actors, cinematography, and the author's vision. But live services do not have such a goal. They exist in a permanent state of not yet. This gives rise to a different economic model. Resources are redistributed not to the quality of the core, but to the amount of peripheral content that can be dosed out monthly. The reason for the high cost of AAA Plus games is not technology or artistic complexity, but an attempt to turn the game into an ecosystem. And this ecosystem needs constant maintenance, marketing, campaigns, services, regular updates to monetization model, A/B testing in the store, new partnerships, and a bunch of crap that has no artistic value. In short, everything that makes today's most expensive games so expensive is also what makes them so mediocre and empty. That's why projects with bigger budgets often look technically poorer, visually simpler, and structurally more monotonous than less expensive but meaningful story-driven games. That is as paradoxical as it may sound, but nowadays, the bigger the budget of a game, the more chances it has to be shitty.